More than 2 million people have fled Ukraine since Russia launched its full-scale invasion less than 2 weeks ago, the United Nations says. Russia warns oil prices could more than double to $300 a barrel, and it might close the main gas pipeline to Germany if the West halts oil imports. The European Commission has prepared further sanctions that will hit more Russian oligarchs and politicians and 3 Belarusian banks, according to reports. The London Metal Exchange has suspended trade in nickel after the base metal rocketed to a record peak above $100,000 on Russian output concerns.
Go! Move!
The United Kingdom has announced another extension of its refugee policy for Ukrainians after being criticised for not doing enough. The number of Ukrainian refugees granted visas under the British scheme has risen from just about 50 to 300. The Home Office announced that over 17,000 applications have begun, with around 9,000 people not yet completed their applications. Some claim that the visa appointment website crashed midway through. Ukrainians attempting to flee to the UK have described intense frustration at what they called bureaucratic hurdles and technical difficulties involved in securing a visa. The British Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has been accused of presiding over chaos. Ukrainian refugees arriving in the French city of Calais say they found notices when they arrived telling them they must apply for visas in Paris or Brussels instead. The UK Home Secretary has admitted that she has not yet set up a visa application centre near the French port of Calais where refugees have arrived. Before parliamentarians, Priti Patel assured MPs that her department was in the process of setting up a centre near Calais to allow people to cross the Channel to Britain. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is also under intense pressure to welcome more refugees from Ukraine. Over 1.3 million Ukrainians have fled since Russia invaded, and the UK has said it will only take those with family connections or sponsorship by a third party. The British Prime Minister has rejected calls to ease visa requirements, saying that Britain was a generous country, but it needed to maintain checks on who was arriving.
Let me be very clear. What we won't do is have a system where people can come into the UK without any checks or any controls at all. I don't think that is the right approach. But what we will do is have a system that is very, very generous.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is all set to make an historic address to the British Parliament later today. He's expected to plead for more arms supply and reiterate his call for a no-fly zone from NATO. According to reports, Zelensky will address the House of Commons directly from Kyiv via video link at around 5 p.m. GMT, and all formal parliamentary business will be suspended during that period. The Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, has granted the request, saying that every parliamentarian wants to hear directly from the Ukrainian president. Zelensky's address comes at a crucial time when Russian troops continue to push deeper into Ukraine. Zelensky has made a string of such addresses to Western leaders since the start of the war. On Saturday, he made a desperate plea to 280 members of the US Congress for more aircraft and drones to counter Russian aggression. In an exclusive interview to US media channel ABC News, Zelensky made a direct appeal to Americans to support his country's war against the Russian invasion.
If you see and if you understand how we feel life, how we fight against all the enemies for our freedom, support us. support us, and not only with words, with concrete, direct steps. Do it, and I think we'll win. Of course, together with all the world.
While the West has ramped up measures to provide aid and arms supply to Ukraine, it's repeatedly rejected calls for an implementation of a no-fly zone, saying that such a measure could lead the war to spill beyond the borders of Ukraine. The UK, meanwhile, has also rejected calls to ease visa requirements for Ukrainian refugees, saying that it needs to maintain checks on who is arriving in the country. France has accused Boris Johnson's government of not doing enough to help Ukrainians in the French city of Calais reunite with their families in the UK. This came after the UK reportedly denied entry to some Ukrainian refugees stuck in the French city. Missiles continue to rain down on Ukrainian cities on the 13th day of the invasion, and Ukraine will attempt to evacuate civilians from 5 of the hardest hit cities under a humanitarian corridor agreed with Russia. A similar ceasefire agreement set on Monday failed, with Ukraine accusing Russia of shelling the passages civilians were supposed to use to flee. In the latest, Russia has announced a ceasefire from 7 GMT so that civilians from a number of Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv, could be evacuated. The Russian Defense Ministry confirmed the opening of humanitarian corridors so civilians can evacuate from the cities of Kyiv, Kharkiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, Mariupol and Irpin. Ukraine too has confirmed the evacuation of civilians from Sumy heading south to the city of Poltava. President Zelensky had accused Moscow of hampering those evacuation efforts by mining roads and destroying buses after Russia had proposed the creation of similar corridors on Monday. But many civilians have refused, as 4 of Moscow's 6 proposed corridors lead straight to either Russia or its ally, Belarus.
Була домовленість про гуманітарні коридори. Чи спрацювала вона? Замість неї спрацювали російські танки, російські гради, російські міни. Вони навіть замінували дорогу, яку погоджували для підвезення продуктів і ліків для людей, для дітей.
These deaths come after multiple attempts. Power in the southern port of Mariupol after 2 failed evacuation attempts there. The Red Cross says that refugees who tried to escape Mariupol using agreed escape routes were left stranded as the road they were directed towards was mined on Monday. Journalists also witnessed thousands of civilians on Monday fleeing the city of Irpin via an unofficial escape route and heading towards the capital. French President Emmanuel Macron slammed Moscow's evacuation routes, asking sarcastically why Ukrainians would want to seek refuge in Russia.
La Russie plaide pour faire des couloirs humanitaires vers la Russie. Je ne connais pas beaucoup d'Ukrainiens qui ont envie d'aller se réfugier en Russie. C'est une hypocrisie. Et donc c'est un artefact de communication que je réprouve. Et les associations qui font un travail formidable, Acted, pour en citer une, la Croix-Rouge internationale et tant d'autres, vous diront que les couloirs humanitaires ne sont pas forcément les solutions qu'elles préfèrent.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin's chief negotiator blamed Ukraine's forces on the ground for ignoring orders which he said led to Russian shelling of humanitarian corridors. He made those comments following the 3rd round of talks with Ukraine, which yielded no breakthrough. Our correspondent Ollie Barrett has sent us this report from Riga in Latvia.
the diplomacy continues today here in Latvia. Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, is in town. He will be visiting Canadian troops who are stationed here in Latvia. We also have a visit from the NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg. I'm sure we will hear NATO's solidarity and resolve stressed again. I'm sure we will also hear questions for Jens Stoltenberg about whether NATO could be involved in enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and I'm sure again we will hear Jens Stoltenberg say that that is not currently part of the plan, that would risk a wider conflict with Russia that NATO allies simply don't want to be involved in. For Antony Blinken, he leaves here and he goes to Estonia, continuing that journey around the Baltic states, which he describes here in Latvia yesterday as a wall of democracy against what he sees as Russian aggression on the other side. He will also, before heading home to the United States, visit with Emmanuel Macron, we expect, in Paris, trying to get a sense of whether Emmanuel Macron's attempts at diplomacy with Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin have shown any signs of success at all.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Moscow of cynicism. Sitting in his office in Kyiv, the Ukrainian leader said that Ukraine would still continue to negotiate a peace deal with Russia, further asserting that he has no intentions of leaving Kyiv.
Понеділок, вечір, ми звикли говорити. Я залишаюсь тут, залишаюсь у Києві, на Банковій, не ховаючись, і нікого не боюсь, стільки, скільки потрібно, щоб перемогти у цій нашій вітчизняній війні.
The raging conflict in Ukraine has caused a major humanitarian crisis in the region. Over 1.7 million people have already fled the country in a span of just a couple of days, which, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency, is the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The United Nations Security Council, meanwhile, held an emergency meeting on Monday to address the growing crisis that unfolded soon after the conflict began. Top UN officials briefed the Security Council on the efforts the organisation is making to assist people inside the country. During the meeting, United Nations Relief Chief Martin Griffiths said that places like Mariupol and Kharkiv are in desperate need of aid and assistance.
We need safe passage for humanitarian supplies into areas of active hostilities. Civilians in places like Mariupol, Kharkiv, Melitopol and elsewhere desperately need aid, especially life-saving medical supplies, the kind that have been brought in these past days by WHO.
The United Nations Security Council meeting came as Russia announced another ceasefire to help evacuate citizens from the war zone. The Russian envoy to the UN said that the Kremlin is now prioritising the provision of a safe passage to civilians. The Ukrainian ambassador to the UN, meanwhile, accused Moscow of shelling humanitarian corridors and making it impossible for civilians to flee.
Russia continues to cynically disregard the norms of international humanitarian law during hostilities. Russian troops block numerous attempts of the Ukrainian authorities to evacuate civilians through humanitarian corridors. They denied access of international organizations to provide humanitarian assistance to the most affected places.
The US envoy to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, also called on Moscow to provide time-bound humanitarian safe passage and a notification system to help aid the evacuation process.
We call for the Russian Federation to agree to and honor in good faith Ukrainian proposals for time-bound humanitarian safe passage in specific agreed-upon locations. We call for the establishment of a ground-level notification system that will facilitate the safe movement of humanitarian convoys and flights.
As of the 6th of March, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has reported at least 406 civilian deaths, but the real figure could be much higher. The World Food Programme, meanwhile, has said that it's offering up supply chain operations to deliver immediate food and cash assistance to up to 5 million people inside Ukraine. Russia has accused the US of plugging millions of dollars into funding biolabs in Ukraine, all of which were possibly involved in trying to produce biological weapons, the Kremlin claims. After first accusing Kyiv of developing dirty bombs, the Russian Defense Ministry then said that it has proof that Ukraine is collaborating with the US to develop biological weapons and that it spent over $200 million to do so. A network of over 30 biological laboratories have been created, according to the Kremlin. Some of them are research labs, the Kremlin says. Others are sanitary epidemiological ones. Russia claims that some labs in Lviv were conducting work with infectious agents, including the plague and anthrax, while labs in Kharkiv and Poltava were alleged to be working with infectious agents of diphtheria and dysentery. Major General Igor Krylov, head of the Russian Armed Forces Nuclear, Biological and Chemical Protection Troops, stated that the biolabs activities, as well as the so-called reform program of Ukraine's healthcare system executed by the US, have led to an increase in cases of highly dangerous and economically significant infections. China has meanwhile urged the United States to clarify its biological activities for military purposes at home and abroad. The United States is yet to comment on the statement made by the Russian Defense Ministry. The Russian invasion of Ukraine pushed thousands of people out of their homes. Millions have been forced to flee Ukraine and seek shelter in neighbouring countries, with harrowing stories to tell. These refugees are now calling for international support to help end the war.
As a flood of Ukrainian refugees fleeing a Russian invasion pours over the borders into neighboring nations, the people bring with them harrowing stories of hardship.
We stayed for a week near Kyiv. We thought it would be safer there than in Kyiv. But our town was bombed. We fled from there. We saw many cars left on the road. A lot of bombed cars. We were escaping to Kyiv, but now the situation in Kyiv is also scary because a few days ago they started bombing Kyiv, and it is very unsafe there.
Yana, who declined to give her surname, spoke to Reuters after crossing into Romania on Monday. She's one of an estimated 1.7 million civilians displaced by the Russian onslaught. And that number could just be the beginning. Here's the European Union's foreign policy chief.
If the bombings continue like this, if they continue to bomb cities in an indiscriminate manner, we can expect 5 million migrants. Well, not migrants. We can't call them migrants. These are exiled people who seek to escape the war.
Far too many are children. At a train station in Przemysl in southeastern Poland, volunteers waited to greet youngsters, some sent without parents, to escape the fighting. In a shelter in the nearby town Medyka, a refugee named Olena, who didn't give her last name, huddled in tents and begged the nations of NATO to enforce a no-fly zone over her country to protect the people from Russian airstrikes.
Every Ukrainian just hopes that NATO will close the sky for us. Because we are ready to fight, and we are ready to protect us from tanks, from artillery, from Grad rockets. But we are not able to protect our sky. We only beg God to protect the sky because NATO is just watching, but doesn't do anything for us. We beg protection.
Poland, which has the largest Ukrainian community in Central Europe, has received more than 1 million Ukrainian refugees since the conflict began. The fighting has created the largest wave of refugees in Europe since the Second World War.
The unfolding humanitarian crisis has not just wreaked havoc on human livelihoods and lives, but also on numerous pets and their owners. Ukrainian pet owners are finding it increasingly difficult to escape with their animals or even provide them with food and other necessities. Our next story brings you an emotional tale from Lviv.
This is Natalia Horobets, bidding an emotional farewell to her beloved cat, Charlie. Charlie, my little one, you will come back home, but you need to stay in a different place for now. You will be good there. Natalia and her husband fled Donetsk, escaping the scenes of fire and devastation. After travelling for 40 hours in a packed train with their pet cat, the couple finally made it to Lviv. But the long, tiring journey and the unfolding humanitarian crisis has forced the couple to take a heartbreaking decision. They have decided to leave their beloved Charlie at an animal shelter in Lviv. Our trip by train lasted for 40 hours. It was really hard for him. He was all over. We tried to keep him next to us so that he could not run away. There were many people and we were afraid that he would be trampled down. The home for rescued animals was previously a home for wild animals and strays. Ever since fighting broke out, they have taken in many such animals from fleeing the violence. Hundreds have passed through the shelter, leaving their furry friends behind. Dogs, cats, and even a pet rat jostle for attention alongside foxes and storks. Now a Latvian volunteer has emerged as a new hero for all the strays trapped in the war zone. Rasma Krisha is the rescuer who travelled to Ukraine to rescue all the pets and take them to safety in Poland. Krisha has an escape plan ready. She is equipped with cages and a large van to take the animals out.
On here we are trying to prepare safe travels for the dogs and cats we're going to take. We are putting the cages in. We are making them secure for secure travel, and we're going to try to take as many animals as we can out, back to Latvia, back to Europe, back to safety.
Natalia Horobets and her husband are scared about their future, but they have found hope in Razma's plans of rescuing pets from Ukraine. Now they just hope to get reunited with their pet Charlie soon. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Queen Elizabeth I said that when men fight wars, women win them. Well, March the 8th is celebrated across the world as International Women's Day. But in Ukraine, women are now trying to handle a war that they never started. We leave you with the story. Thanks for watching.
To be with little baby and run away from my family, from my husband, from my sister and parents. It's very hard because I'm alone here, and I have no support here as well because my family is still in Kiev and still living in a war.
I didn't think about this day.
many other. This is right, Arab.